For last 6 7 months, I have been very much in the process of studying Russell in depth. The process has, I will not say it was, the journey was painful, but it was exciting as well as in some sense exhausting. Because time and again I did not intend to stretch it this amount. At every point, I felt that I am not doing enough justice to Russellian scholarship. So if I have to say something genuine about him or his writings, I have to just surf through his literature in and out. At least that part of the literature, which is interested in his uh, how he construes knowledge, structure of knowledge as such, the various phases he has gone through, the various ups and turns, the various phases in terms of right from his inception to it from his PhD thesis, to the stage where he started having not only students but followers, not only students and followers but also critics, not only critics who not only criticized him, but in the process he also responded to their criticism, sometimes silently, sometimes even going into a sort of introversion, revisiting some of his notions which he had pioneered earlier. For example, particularly if you study his relationship with Wittgenstein and Russell, which is very much interesting as well as intriguing, because a lot of there was self-censored censorship of Russell when he wrote some aspects of knowledge, how he after his construction of Principia, how he viewed fundamental knowledge. So, so under the heavy criticism of Wittgenstein, somehow Russell postponed that project or his particular way he or particular track how he wanted to approach that very subject, even though not purely for reasons of scholarship, but maybe reasons of honesty. Felt he self-imposed academic honesty will somehow be what I should say. It's sanctity of that self-constructed image of honesty, which he felt will be somehow dishonored if he did not respond to the criticism of young Wittgenstein. So in the meantime, he what I should say postponed the very grand his grand idea of constructing the human knowledge, the breadth and scope of human knowledge, which will extend from epistemology to metaphysics to philosophy to sciences to linguistics. But uh, he was somehow committed to the logico-mathematical method and the success of Principia, which was considered a sort of, after Aristotle, it was considered uh, it was considered success, a very grand achievement of reducing all mathematics to logic or symbolic logic, to put it more in a more restricted sense. But later developments, criticism of Wittgenstein, and also the Gödelization of when he, the particular result of Gödel when he said that arithmeticization of logic is somehow not possible within the axiomatic structure we are having. Somehow, even though psychologically Russell was still committed to that project of knowledge and trying to reduce, and in that process, later stage in he wrote Human Knowledge, Scope and Limits. Even though he was aware of the limitations of mathematical logical method in extending that method to the scientific methodology. But in the starting 1912 and 13, he was very much enthusiastic about that very project, which might have got retarded with the developments, with the criticism of Wittgenstein, as well as that of Gödel's theorem. But when, in the meantime, the Russellian project of writing for like analysis of matter, analysis of mind, and his preoccupation with the doctrine of neutral monism, mind and matter debate. So, so he was not primarily preoccupied with this debate of mind and matter. He was, I would say, he was occupied. He would have wanted himself. He would have wanted, if you search the literature, that he would have wanted to get preoccupied with the grand project of knowledge as such within that logico-mathematical paradigm. But the events of somehow the criticisms of Wittgenstein and Gödelian, the the sort of developments of Gödelian theorem on mathematics, somehow he changed track. But by heart he was not convinced. But in the meantime, he might have shifted to some other debates of mind and matter. And in the process, he might have influenced by that William James ideology, William James pragmatism, or William James psychological, which is his understanding neutral monism. His papers of being empiricists, methodological empiricists, and his understanding of new psychology and how he wanted to somehow have this, how he invoked this doctrine of neutral monism. Somehow Russell was influenced by these developments, and as also the developments in general theory of relativity. So he was not as such influenced in the general relativity, being primarily a researcher. So he studied the secondary, not maybe works. In the meantime, he also wrote ABC of relativity, the ABC of atoms. So he was more or less interested in the ontology of matter. What is matter in the ontological sense? And in the process, he not only was interested in the matter, he was interested in the two fundamental theories which were emerging, quantum theory, as well as he surfed through all the literature of relativity. You can see in the book Analysis of Matter, he is quoting Wheel and Eddington, on and off. But that is in the background of the scientific method, the application of scientific method, how he tries to view the deductive empirical generalizations from the relativity and the ontology which is being constructed out of that. He's analyzing that question in that way to me. Modulo the fact that the understanding of his quantum theory was somehow ad hoc, in the sense that maybe many of the things which are written in the book Analysis of Matter about quantum theory, they might be obsolete, but he should contextualize it in the sense that he was trying to make sense, a thorough sense of the knowledge of matter, which was being which we could get from these fundamental theories like quantum theory and general theory of relativity, which in later stage there was a full-fledged program of quantum field theory, gravity, and in modern days the things has been taken to be very But the point which I want to emphasize is how Russell, in some fundamental sense, wanted to construct an ontology of matter and mind. And somehow, until 1927, when he wrote Principles of Philosophy and our knowledge of external world, his unique he was unique on what he called perceptions. And when he famously said, "Mind is not mind. Mind should not be less mental, and matter should be less than material." So he was basically trying to be not too rigid in materialism and not too much emphasizing on the cognitive aspect, reducing the materiality of the existence of the universe in terms of some cognitive domain. So he invoked the notions of neutral monism, which was there till 1927 or so. But later, I would rather say that the human knowledge part, which was the magnum opus, he would want to come to that debate of how the logical mathematical method, when it's applied to scientific methodology, or the induction part of it, the deductive deductive empirical methodology of scientific method, which was dominant at that time, and mathematical method. So can we somehow converse? Can we juxtapose them, or can we appropriate one for other with modulo something? So in some sense, at some point in his writings, you could see he is saying that even though the deductive empirical method used in scientific methodology has some interesting intersections with the mathematical induction. Like when you are going to say something is true, so you are going to take examples. You go by induction, you test the thing for one example, then second example more, and then you can go for large things of examples, and we assume that the statement may be true for n number of assumptions. So you prove from a particular fact and you generalize it by certain inductive methodology to a general fact. So you come from uh, so our law, you can say, you arrive at a conclusion from a premise. So you can start from a conclusion by a particular inductive methodology, but you can arrive at a certain statement. So we don't normally state the general our understanding of law in this way. It is, you start from particular and you arrive at some general statement which we call law, with the fact that if there is always a particular example which will contradict the general rule or a statement, we can say it's an exception to the law, and there is always a scope that we can improvise that law at higher energies. In the particular case being the Newtonian mechanics being a particular example, a limiting case of quantum mechanics, or the the astronomical observations of Newton's laws of gravitation being a limiting case of general theory of relativity. This is one way of looking at it. So you arrive at a general statement via inductive methodology, but that general statement is ultimately, you can also invert the statement that there is a premise, this is a law, and we can prove it in some particular cases. In mathematics also we have a general formal structure or an axiomatic structure where don't we don't our methodology of induction is somewhat inverted. We don't go from particular to general, we go from general to particular and case by case test the thing theoretically also. So in a sense, Russell in his writings has shown that when the complex the argumentation of the that you start from a given premise and you reach a conclusion, but in some mathematical formalisms, is there a possibility can there can be many premises but you reach a single conclusion? So you can just sort of loosen up the rigid formal or axiomatic structure of the starting assumptions of the premises, but you can still arrive at a particular conclusion which may be true. But if you apply this methodology strictly to the you apply this methodology strictly to the scientific methodology, it may not necessarily hold with the because the data or the contingency associated with the observations which 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 are ad hoc or contingent at every point. So a given if there is a given law, so there is your observations or your generalization, if there is a law, they should uniquely point out to one single statement. So the rigidity of a formal law or a statement to restrict our observations in a particular direction, in a particular rigid way. So that freedom which we have in mathematical methodology or the induction, the mathematical induction and the scientific induction. So he is somehow trying to make similarities as well as some complexities which are inherent in that debate. But later, if you see his the modulo, the induction, the inductive methodology, he is also coalescing it with then the dominant with the paradigm. I would not say dominant paradigm, the paradigm of Humean empiricism. So the Humean empiricism. So in a way, you can say Russell was Humean in his earlier stages. He was very much appreciative of empiricism, but somehow at some, and not only empiricism in logical positivism, but at some stage he would have been a nuanced empiricist because of the fact when he somehow also in his later stages critiqued Hume, saying that Hume somehow, I mean, in matters of examples, that there's a particular way he says that if you apply the induction method, for example, there's a chicken. So every day a guy comes, he's going to give him, the master who is feeding the chicken, he gives him some, he feeds him. But one fine day, he comes with the knife. So according to Russell, that Humean empiricists would rather prefer prefer grain for the stones. So they will only take the induction in an affirmative sense. They are not interested in those examples which they'll negate their original hypotheses. So from this hypothesis, Russell somehow was interested more in that he invoked the term of non-demonstrative inference. So that non-demonstrative inference, in that he also used that rigid axiomatic structure of a piano, and there were more than 5 axioms and a structure. But somehow it was surprising for him that that non-demonstrative inference. Uh, he arrived at this assumption that our in the process of inductive uh, inference, in the process of trying to prove things by induction, so you have to somehow modify it by a notion of non-demonstrative inference, that where you can, or there is always scope of an example which you cannot prove by example, which may be counterintuitive, but the scope should be there in the original, the way we started with the action structure, how you can, the induction process should be there, and the final thing should not be truth affirming, it should be truth conductive, it should not be truth preserving. The or original of hypothesis should not be truth preserving, it should be truth conductive, because in the human induction you have this thing that the truth is always going to be preserved, so you search for those examples only. So how he arrived at non-inductive inference, he not only went through non-inductive inference, he basically there is a debate in Keynes' theory of probability, or Bayesian probability, or Bayesian probability. So how Keynes constructed the assumptions of probability. So the a priori notions of certain expectations of a certain event. So the a priori notions, are they going to be seriously so the a priori assumptions which are invoked when we are trying to verify or nullify something by virtue of inductive inference, or so those very assumptions are very much, so a priori-ness of those very assumptions. So somehow Russell critiqued it in a fundamental way. I will not say fundamental way, somehow Russell critiqued it. Why should our the a priority of those assumptions? But Russell's methodology was also critiqued, because they were saying that why should we take the philosophical notions of why should we take the philosophical actions that seriously, when we are going to have those truth conducting, when we are going to have those non-demonstrative uh, truth conducting statements. So why should we take those philosophical assumptions? So it's more a matter of psychology, cognitive. There were other scholars who are in the literature who rather have critiqued Russell by trying to say that the it's more important the cognitive domain, the why we, our mind or psychology tries to invest in certain a priori probabilities. The question should be addressed that way. The philosophy may be important, the philosophical assumptions underlying may be important, but it's more a matter of cognitive domain, why our mind chooses it that way. So people more nowadays, maybe people in cognitive sciences, computer sciences, data sciences, maybe they might be addressing these very questions, neurosciences, in some different way. So the essential aim is basically try to say is that Russell, in a very significant way, has attempted to uh, apply the idea of this induction, and critiqued human induction, also Keynes' theory of probability, and uh, try to uniquely give his own system of non-demonstrative inference with the underlying logical structure, which is also having some assumptions, uh, and which in maybe solve a lot of things. course, it might have its own limitations. Here, I would want to rather say there are one, two things. Somewhere Russell writes that pure empiricism. He's not saying that empiricism, when you take it in a very Catholic way, it will also lead to skepticism. And somehow he is not also. I was trying to say the induction, the scientific induction and mathematical induction, the debate he so much was interested in. It was somehow in the underlying frame of empiricism as a philosophy. But I would say Russell Wood was a sophisticated empiricist in the sense that he somewhere writes that the pure empiricism leads to skepticism. And skepticism as a philosophy, if you take it seriously, it's not somehow justified. And there's a particular chapter also in human knowledge, scope and limits, where he has used the word term solipsism. So he is also critiquing that thing that if you take empiricism to its limits, it leads to sometimes skepticism or solipsism, which is not somehow tenable in an honest way. Any doctrine which you, the skepticism is not tenable. This is his argument. So because it leads to subjectivities which cannot be, which are not as a human endeavor. You cannot extend it beyond a certain point. So he was empiricist, but not empiricist in that cruder sense. And he would rather try to maintain a very respectful distance from logical positivists also. And in fact, at some point in time, he wanted to he addressed this question how he would, in your earlier studies, he was a logical positivist, but he would want to try to explain his position in a very nuanced way. So I would rather further. So I have talked of empiricism, induction, and skepticism, but I would rather also say the very important doctrine of Russell was philosophical atomism, where he tried to reduce the Russell being the philosopher of language also, he tried to reduce the abstractness or the conceptualization of sentences and words and realities when he wanted to have a particular map with the logic. So he would characterize things in terms of grammatical sentence. What is the relationship between grammar and sentences? So some sentences may be grammatically right, are they logically right also? So in that process, if you read his Human Knowledge Scope, Inquiry into Meaning and Truth and Logic and Knowledge, in those interesting essays, so he has arrived a very interesting doctrine of logical atomism. So where he has tried to arrive at the atomicity of the ultimate words and meanings, which may be in terms of colors, it may be in terms of qualities or adjectives. So that doctrine is also very interesting in the total Russellian methodology, how he constructs the philosophy of logical atomism. And his understanding of perception, mind, matter. So these are very very convoluted debates, because at different stages he has tried to address a particular question, Russell. So in the process, sometimes he may not, the writings of Russell may convey that Russell is contradicting Russell himself. Earlier Russell is sometimes contradicting later Russell. So there's a very interesting article for example, where Russell has written the cause in the late Russell. I don't remember the name of the author. There's a good essay, cause in the. So initial stage, how he, for example, there are three ways of understanding knowledge. One is inference, the other is causation, and induction. So how we arrive at, I would say, truth or truth. Truth is also a justified belief. So, so causation. So his understanding of causation in earlier stage, Russell had a particular understanding of cause and effect, and in later stage, in the with the advent of quantum mechanics and with the advent of other things, he might have somehow improvised in the causation, not in that restrictive sense. So the way I have talked about induction, his evolution in induction, how he arrived at mathematical induction to scientific induction, then human induction, then non-demonstrative induction. So this is a journey. In the same way, how he understood causation in his earlier stages, being an empiricist, then later stages with the advent of quantum mechanics and other developments like uncertainty principle. So he would still want to believe in cognition in a religious sense, but he would amend the stricter uh, adherence to the causality in that religiosity in the religious sense. In the same way, he would very much be interested in mind and matter, uh, and trying to somehow make amends, because so how what he calls percept, what he calls matter. So he might have sometimes invoked the notions of uh, cognition or psychology over matter or matter over mind, or when he famously said mind over matter, mind is less material and mind is less mental, trying to make the doctrine of neutral monism. So you have to see the contextualization in which Russell was basically trying to somehow uh, somehow at different stages addressing different questions, and he was grappling with different answers. So in the process, he might seem to be contradicting himself, but I would rather, it's a personal statement. You could rather see that it's an evolution of a mind, and you could appreciate that evolution with the advent of various developments, the scientific developments, the philosophical developments, the developments in mathematics. And he's responding also to critiques, sometimes accepting them wholeheartedly, sometimes succumbing to them, but addressing the things in his later stages with his refined arguments, sometimes even accepting that he might have been lopsided or floppy, and some that happens. So that's it. So in a way, I would rather conclude to say that I would rather try to address to this I would rather try to end this very lecture with the thing that the methodology of Bertrand Russell uh, has been still relevant. I would rather connect it to the current contemporary world, contemporary science. In contemporary science is so nowadays there's a lot of debate, particularly in fields of string theory, fields of quantum gravity, the use of uh, even the in use of mathematics in sciences. So what is in mathematics which is not physics, and what is in physics which is not mathematics? Or people will talk of whether string theory is also a science or not, because the heavy use of mathematics in it. So people might have aesthetic motivation, some physical motivations, scientific motivations of using those mathematical constructions. Or for some, for example, physics is mathematics but at a lower level of abstraction. What was yesterday is physics, mathematics is today's physics. So some people will invert it other way. So the debate is as old, but this has got significant even now with the in the sense that the mathematical method and scientific method, or mathematical induction and scientific induction. So maybe this debate of Russell has some relevance to the to address the questions we are addressing. And I would not go into the details of it because there may be other scholars like Karl Popper, and there are other people also. So I'll connect them in some way, other lecture, future lecture. So maybe I would set the stage. I'll stop here. I'll keep it as a curiosity or exploration for the individual viewer, or impend the question to some appropriate future. Thanks.